The morning sunlight poured over the neighborhood, illuminating freshly mowed lawns, sparkling windows, and the crisp lines of identical suburban houses. At first glance, everything looked calm, peaceful, and ordinary. Birds chirped, sprinklers glistened in the sun, and the quiet hum of distant lawnmowers suggested a perfectly normal Saturday. Yet beneath this serene suburban exterior, tension had quietly taken root in my backyard, a tension that was about to erupt in ways I could never have predicted. My fence had stood for years, a simple, elegant structure of white cedar, freshly painted and perfectly aligned with the property line. It wasn't extravagant, wasn't overbearing, but it marked my yard, my space, my boundary in a neighborhood that prided itself on conformity. To me, it was nothing more than a fence, a practical solution to keep the pets safe and the kids contained. But to the HOA, it had become an issue, a glaring violation waiting to be magnified and weaponized. It started subtly, with a letter slipped under my door, crisp and official-looking. The words "illegal fence" jumped out at me immediately, the typeface cold and impersonal. The letter claimed that my fence violated HOA regulations, that it was out of compliance with neighborhood codes, and that immediate action was required to avoid fines, penalties, and potential legal action. Sunlight reflected off the envelope as I held in my hand, the brightness contrasting sharply with the anxiety rising in my chest. The calm day suddenly felt heavy, the light almost mocking the storm that was about to arrive. As I stepped into the yard, examining the fence with a critical eye, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. Every board, every post, every nail suddenly seemed to represent more than just construction. They had become symbols of compliance or defiance, depending on whose eyes were judging. The sun glinted off the crisp white paint, highlighting the perfection I had achieved with care, yet the HOA letter painted the same fence as a criminal offense. The juxtaposition between the tranquil suburban scene and the threat looming over my property was jarring. The morning air carried more than birdsong. It carried a tension that vibrated in the sunlight itself. Shadows of trees stretched across the lawn, sharp and bright in the early day, their lines cutting across the fence in strange, angular patterns. The fence looked different under this harsh scrutiny, almost like it was under interrogation by the sun itself. Even the flowers along the edge of the yard, bright and cheerful, seemed to lean subtly, as if observing, bearing silent witness to the absurdity of the complaint. I knew the HOA's reputation. Stories of petty fines, arbitrary complaints, and aggressive enforcement tactics floated through the neighborhood like whispers, the gossip of countless frustrated homeowners. They had power, but only when people allowed it to dominate their lives. And yet, the way the letter had landed in my hands made it feel immediate, personal, and slightly sinister. The sun shone brightly, but there was a shadow in that light, the shadow of authority misused, waiting to be challenged. As I walked the length of the fence, inspecting it carefully, I noticed small details I had never paid attention to before. The way the sunlight kissed each post, the tiny gaps between boards that allowed air and light to pass, the subtle curvature of the ground beneath the foundation. Every inch of the fence was alive with history, with effort, with intention. And yet, the HOA had distilled all of that into a single accusation: illegal. The notion felt absurd, almost farcical, but there was a dark undertone beneath the surface, a suggestion that this fence was a gateway to something larger. Later that morning, another envelope arrived. This one carried photographs taken from angles I had never noticed, images of my yard and my fence captured seemingly without my knowledge. The sunlight reflected harshly off the glossy prints, exaggerating every detail, emphasizing every measurement as if attempting to make a case for something sinister. The photos were labeled with notes in red ink, detailing supposed infractions, yet there was something peculiar in their precision, something unervingly meticulous. The attention to detail hinted that the HOA's interest was not merely about rules or regulations. There was a deeper motive lurking beneath the surface, one that the bright day could not entirely illuminate. The sun climbed higher, illuminating every inch of my property with a relentless clarity that left nothing hidden. It revealed the fence in perfect detail, every post casting a small, crisp shadow, every nail and seam sharply outlined. It also revealed the absurdity of the claims. The fence was safe, beautiful, and entirely within my property line. Yet the HOA's letter suggested otherwise, implying control over a space that was inherently mine. This daylight clarity brought a strange mix of reassurance and anger. The sun confirmed what I already knew, but it also highlighted the audacity of those who sought to manipulate the rules to their advantage. By midday, I had begun to notice odd patterns in the neighborhood. My neighbors, once casual and distant, now watched with curiosity or concern. A bright sun reflected off windows across the street, revealing fleeting glimpses of people whispering, exchanging notes, and perhaps documenting the scene. I felt a subtle tension in the air, a ripple beneath the surface of suburban tranquility. The bright daylight that should have offered comfort now emphasized the scrutiny, the surveillance, and the imminent confrontation that loomed like a storm on the horizon. The fence was no longer just a fence. It had become a symbol, a bright white line separating more than yard from yard, but authority from autonomy, control from freedom. Every sunlit inch seemed to hum with anticipation, each shadow stretching across the lawn like a silent observer waiting for the first move. And in that anticipation, I realized something crucial. If I allowed the HOA to dictate the narrative, to define right and wrong in the bright light of day, I would lose more than a fence. I could lose the very sense of agency I had over my home and my life. With that realization, the course of action became clear. The bright, unrelenting sunlight that had illuminated the scene so perfectly also revealed a truth. The HOA's power was only as strong as the fear it generated. Their accusations were loud, their letters formal, their threats detailed, but their intentions could be challenged. And as the sun glinted off the top of the fence, highlighting its clean, steadfast posts, I felt a surge of resolve. This was no longer about a fence. This was about uncovering the truth hidden beneath layers of compliance, secrecy, and suburban politeness. The first chapter of this suburban battle had concluded with a sense of suspended tension. The letters had been delivered, the accusations made, the sunlight had revealed the fence in all its glory, but beneath that bright clarity, a shadow of something far larger waited to be exposed. Something that would turn the tables on those who thought they could control me. The day was far from over, and the real story was only beginning. Every sunlit inch of my yard hinted at secrets waiting to surface, mistakes waiting to be revealed, and the inevitable confrontation that would uncover more than just a fence violation. The HOA had thought they were in control, but the bright light of day, the truth of the fence, and my own determination promised a reckoning that none of them saw coming. Next chapter. The first surveillance and strange patterns in the neighborhood begin to emerge, hinting that the HOA's interest in my property is far more suspicious than a simple fence complaint. The morning arrived with a sharp clarity that seemed to illuminate every corner of the neighborhood. Sunlight poured down across manicured lawns, shining on identical suburban homes, reflecting off windows and cars, and revealing even the smallest details of my yard and fence. But the bright day that should have brought calm now brought tension, as I noticed subtle movements that had gone unnoticed yesterday. It started with the shadows. Shadows of people, or at least what appear to be people, moving fleetingly across the sidewalks from houses across the street. The sunlight cast long angles that made them visible in ways that felt almost deliberate, as though the day itself was drawing attention to patterns that were being carefully orchestrated. At first, it seemed coincidental, a trick of the light, but the pattern repeated. A neighbor walking their dog in the morning sun paused suspiciously, glancing in my direction. A car slowly drove past, then circled back. Even the brightness of the day could not disguise the tension growing along the street. Then I noticed the cameras. Small, inconspicuous devices mounted on lampposts and the corners of neighboring homes, their dark lenses glinting in the sun as if reflecting tiny rays of intent. Some were security cameras. Others appeared more professional, more deliberate, positioned at angles that focused on my property, my fence, and my yard. The sunlight glinted off them like eyes catching every movement, recording each step I took. Each reflection seemed to heighten the sense of scrutiny, turning the bright, open yard into a stage under relentless observation. Walking along the fence, examining each post, each seam, I began to notice anomalies in the footage that had been delivered in the HOA letter. Their photos, meant to prove violations, were too precise. They had been captured from angles that seemed impossible without intentional positioning. The lighting in each photo perfectly highlighted supposed infractions, shadows falling exactly where they needed to in order to create the illusion of wrongdoing. The bright daylight that revealed the beauty of the fence also revealed the orchestrated precision of their surveillance. Every shadow, every beam of sunlight seemed manipulated to cast doubt on my property, and suddenly, the issue of an illegal fence felt like the tip of an iceberg, an orchestrated distraction from something much darker. I began to map the angles of the cameras and lights. Every camera across the street had a line of sight that intersected with my yard at critical points. The corner posts, the gates, even the slight slope in the lawn where water pooled during heavy rains. Sunlight accentuated these angles, revealing their calculated placement. It was almost cinematic, the neighborhood perfectly ordered, perfectly maintained, yet harboring hidden mechanisms of control aimed squarely at me. The day's brightness illuminated the tools of surveillance. Yet the HOA seemed unaware that the clarity of light also exposed their strategy. As I studied the street, patterns became clear. The same cars that drove past yesterday appeared again, sometimes circling, sometimes parked briefly as occupants recorded angles or jotted notes. The sun reflected sharply off license plates and windshields, giving a fleeting, almost dazzling insight into their movements. Even the sidewalks, the open areas where children played and neighbors walked dogs, became a network of observation points, each one subtly participating in the watch. A bright day had transformed into a natural spotlight, revealing the surveillance scheme in a way that darkness could never allow. Then came the first real proof. While watering the front lawn, sunlight hitting the corner of the shed created a sharp reflection off a metallic object lying near the back fence. Moving closer, I found a small professional-grade camera hidden partially beneath shrubbery, its lens angled toward my backyard. Its presence was unmistakable. Someone had been recording without permission, carefully documenting every inch of my property, framing images to make normal actions appear suspicious. The intensity of the daylight only highlighted its metallic body, making it impossible to ignore. The discovery of that single device set off a chain reaction in my mind. If they had gone to such lengths to monitor a fence, what else were they hiding? Could this obsession with compliance be masking other, darker activities? The bright day no longer offered mere illumination. It had become a revealing agent, uncovering details the HOA likely thought were invisible. Every glint, every reflection, every shadow was evidence, silent, bright testimony to a scheme far larger than a fence dispute. Throughout the day, I began photographing the angles myself. Each image captured the same precision the HOA had used against me. Lines of sight, reflections of cameras and neighboring windows, even the subtle sway of trees and shrubs that hid devices in plain sight. I noticed inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. The areas of the fence they claimed were illegal were perfect, aligned with property lines, and structurally sound. The supposed violations were imaginary, manufactured, meant to justify the surveillance. The bright sunlight made the truth undeniable. Their accusations were masked. Neighbors began to appear, drawn by the unusual attention focused on my property. Some glanced curiously. Others cautiously approached, careful not to draw the HOA's notice. In the brightness of the afternoon, I realized the truth of the neighborhood was slowly surfacing. The HOA's tactics had relied on secrecy, subtle intimidation, and the willingness of others to remain silent. But under the unrelenting clarity of daylight, their carefully constructed illusion was beginning to crumble. Even the smallest details, the angle of a lens, the reflection off a car, the glint of sunlight on a metallic device, spoke volumes. By mid-afternoon, it became obvious that the HOA's obsession with my fence was not about compliance. It was about control, and perhaps more. Each camera, each reflection, each note taken from afar was a piece of a puzzle that, once assembled, hinted at misconduct. Bright daylight revealed what darkness would have hidden, a system of surveillance, coordination, and manipulation designed to intimidate and to hide something larger. The very devices meant to enforce rules were betraying their owners. The first steps toward uncovering the truth had been taken. The bright, unyielding sunlight exposed not only the technical precision of the cameras, but also the cracks in the HOA's narrative. Each angle, each reflection, each hidden lens was a breadcrumb leading toward revelations they never intended me to see. The fence, accused of illegality, had become a tool of exposure. The very thing they scrutinized to intimidate me would soon become the instrument of their downfall. As the day drew toward evening, shadows lengthened across the yard, though the sunlight remained strong, bathing the neighborhood in a warm, bright glow. Each camera, each observer, each reflection became part of a visible pattern, a map of deception that I could trace and record. The HOA believed they were watching me, but the sunlight and careful observation were revealing them in return. Their own tools, their own surveillance, were betraying them under the clarity of day. The story was just beginning. What had started as a petty accusation about offense had evolved into something far larger, a slowly unfolding exposure of hidden crimes, observed under the unblinking gaze of daylight. Every bright reflection, every carefully angled lens, every subtle shadow was a clue, and I was beginning to connect them. The stage had been set, the evidence was emerging, and the once bright suburban streets now held the first hints of revelation. Next chapter, the evidence begins to accumulate, revealing patterns in HOA actions that hint at deliberate misconduct and potentially illegal behavior, leading toward the first major breakthrough in exposing their hidden crimes. The morning sun spilled across the neighborhood with almost harsh brilliance, highlighting every detail in the suburban expanse. Each house gleamed, every sidewalk sparkled, and the white cedar posts of my fence glowed sharply against the vibrant green of the lawn. The bright clarity that day offered was no longer just illumination. It was a tool of revelation, a lens through which the first real truths about the HOA began to emerge. After days of scrutinizing the neighborhood, noting camera angles, patterns of movement, and surveillance artifacts, a breakthrough began to take shape. While tracing the lines of sight from the cameras perched across the street, I noticed something remarkable. Several of the camera lenses reflected small, irregular shapes in the background of my property. Tiny metallic glints, almost imperceptible under normal circumstances, but glaringly obvious in the unrelenting sunlight. These reflections hinted at something more than casual observation. It wasn't just about the fence. With careful observation, I began recording and cataloging these reflections. Sunlight bounced off them at precise angles, almost as if inviting inspection, and it became clear that these were not random pieces of metal or debris. Hidden devices, microphones, recording units, and additional cameras were embedded discreetly along the borders of my property, some tucked behind hedges, others fastened to utility poles or neighboring structures. The very tools that had been used to intimidate me now betrayed the presence of a far-reaching and systematic surveillance operation. The sense of revelation was exhilarating, but it was also chilling. The HOA, the same entity that had demanded I remove a fence, had clearly been orchestrating a network of observation with a sophistication I hadn't imagined. They had used the pretext of illegal construction as a mask, a distraction, while they quietly monitored every movement in and around my property. The sunlight, streaming relentlessly across the yard, made it impossible for any device to remain hidden forever, and with each reflection and shadow, The web of deceit they had spun began to unravel. I retraced my steps to a point along the fence where the most glaring reflection had been captured. There, nestled beneath the dense shrubbery, was a small, partially camouflaged control unit, wires disappearing into neighboring properties. Sunlight illuminated it with almost theatrical clarity, drawing attention to a critical hub in their surveillance network. The bright day revealed what darkness could never have betrayed. The HOA's claim about my fence had been a smokescreen. Their real concern was the information they could gather from monitoring every inch of my life, the minute details of movement, behavior, and even interactions with neighbors. As I documented the devices, another realization struck. The patterns of monitoring aligned too neatly with the timing of HOA correspondence and complaints. Photos delivered in the letters, claimed violations, and notices were not merely coincidental. They had been strategically planned to coincide with times when these cameras could capture my actions most disadvantageously. Sunlight had revealed their orchestration. Yet even the HOA seemed unaware that the very bright clarity of day was exposing their methods and undermining their strategy. The first clear evidence of misconduct became undeniable. Using a series of photos I had taken over the previous days, I created a map of surveillance coverage across my property. Each lens, each reflection, each subtle glint of metal was connected, forming a network that showed deliberate monitoring and potentially illegal observation. Their accusations about the fence had been a distraction, a cover for a far more intrusive and unethical operation. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through me. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer merely defending a fence. I was uncovering a systematic abuse of authority. Neighbors began to appear more frequently during these bright mornings, their curiosity visible as they walked past, glanced at the fence, or paused to observe my meticulous inspection. Some were hesitant, shielding their own participation. Others seemed subtly aware of the pattern. The sunlight that filled the neighborhood made these interactions impossible to hide. Each passerby cast shadows, reflected off windows and cars, inadvertently documenting the scenario. The neighborhood, once a uniform backdrop of suburban tranquility, had become a stage where truth and deception were playing out under the relentless scrutiny of daylight. By midday, the compilation of photographic evidence revealed something astonishing. In the background of one image, a set of HOA officers or contractors, previously unseen, appeared mid-surveillance, documenting the property in detail. Their shadows, stretched by the bright sun, betrayed their presence and movements, forming a trail that directly contradicted their claims of compliance checks. The very devices intended to maintain authority had inadvertently revealed the real violations: unauthorized observation, misrepresentation, and an abuse of power. The breakthrough was not just in the discovery of hidden equipment. It was in the clarity that daylight provided. Every metallic glint, every shadow, every reflected lens captured a moment of truth. The HOA's carefully constructed facade of authority, of adherence to rules and neighborhood codes, began to crumble under the evidence illuminated by the sun. A fence, previously accused of illegality, had become the lens through which their crimes were now visible. The very object they sought to regulate had inadvertently exposed them. The bright day continued, stretching hours into the afternoon, with shadows slowly shifting across the lawn. Each movement of the sun revealed additional details previously unnoticed: small wiring hidden along fence posts, lenses tucked beneath roof eaves, even subtle disturbances in flower beds indicating recent equipment placement. The sunlight, which had once merely illuminated my property, had now become an ally, unveiling a complex system of surveillance and manipulation that the HOA had assumed would remain invisible. Every discovery brought a mix of satisfaction and caution. The evidence of wrongdoing was undeniable, yet I knew the stakes were rising. The HOA, if they realized the extent to which their operation had been exposed, could escalate their efforts, attempt to manipulate or intimidate further, or even deny the truth entirely. The bright Daytime clarity that had revealed the hidden cameras also emphasized the need for meticulous documentation and strategy. The exposure of their network was only the beginning. What came next would require careful planning and continued vigilance. As the sun began to shift toward late afternoon, casting long, golden rays across the fence, I stepped back to survey the scene. Every inch of the yard, every post, every shrubbery and tree now told a story, not just of a fence, but of deception, surveillance, and the audacity of the HOA. The devices, once tools of intimidation, now betrayed the very people who installed them. Daylight. The morning light spilled across the neighborhood with a clarity that made it impossible to hide anything. Every fence post, every glint of metal, every reflection in a window or car mirror stood out as if illuminated for the purpose of revelation. The brightness of the day brought not comfort, but an acute awareness. Every movement, every step, every glance could be observed and recorded if one were vigilant. After days of carefully mapping camera angles, reflections, and patterns of surveillance, the scope of the HOA's operation had become undeniable. Walking along the edge of my property, I could trace the line of sight from the cameras one more time. Sunlight caught a tiny metallic glimmer near the base of a neighboring shrub, revealing another hidden device. It was small, unobtrusive, almost like a pebble placed deliberately to avoid notice. Yet the sun reflected off it with unerring precision, betraying its presence to anyone willing to look. The intensity of the day exposed the HOA's meticulous planning. The cameras, wires, and recording units formed a network of surveillance that extended far beyond my fence. What had been portrayed as a simple illegal fence issue was, in truth, a cover for systematic observation of my property in daily life. The realization brought a surge of determination. The neighborhood had remained quiet for weeks, but the bright daylight illuminated not just the physical space, but also the pattern of behavior. Each time an HOA official or contractor appeared, they repeated a predictable routine, photographing specific sections of my property, taking notes at exact angles, often coinciding with times when I performed normal tasks, watering plants, adjusting the fence gate, tending to the lawn. The sunlight highlighted every motion, every gesture, turning mundane activity into evidence. I began compiling a record of the devices, mapping every camera, lens, and reflection. The layout resembled a tactical diagram, each point connected to the next by invisible lines of intent. Some devices had been mounted on trees, others along fences, and some even disguised within neighboring structures, all strategically positioned to maximize coverage. The HOA's pretense of authority had been a smokescreen. The real agenda was monitoring, cataloging, and potentially manipulating. The brightness of the day betrayed them at every turn, casting harsh clarity over the intricate web of surveillance they assumed was invisible. As I documented the devices, a deeper pattern emerged. Certain angles and cameras were not just focused on the fence. They were aimed to capture interactions with neighbors, deliveries, and movements of anyone passing by. Each piece of footage could be used to create a narrative of compliance or infraction, depending on the HOA's intentions. The sunlight revealed more than metal glints. It illuminated the audacity of their plan and the precision with which it had been executed. The so-called fence issue was a distraction, a red herring meant to hide the surveillance operation. The breakthrough in my analysis came when I noticed inconsistencies in the HOA's official letters. Photos presented as evidence were taken from angles only possible with the assistance of devices I had now discovered. Shadows, reflections, and perspectives all indicated manipulation. The bright daylight, which had initially served as a simple backdrop, now acted as a natural forensic tool, exposing the HOA's duplicity. Their accusations about illegal construction had no basis in fact. Every supposed violation could be disproven by straightforward observation under the sun. With evidence mounting, the next step became clear: confrontation. The goal was not conflict, but exposure. The bright, unyielding daylight could act as a witness, revealing every deception the HOA had attempted to conceal. As I prepared, I reviewed the patterns once more, noting when and where the HOA officials typically appeared, the angles they favored, and the timing of their inspections. The precision of their actions mirrored the precision of their devices. Every visit orchestrated to reinforce the illusion of authority. Every camera angle calculated to suggest infractions where none existed. By late morning, the neighborhood had begun to stir. Passers-by glanced curiously at my yard, noticing the meticulous documentation of the devices. Some observed without comment, but their presence reinforced the transparency of the situation. The sun, high and bright, revealed the entire scene in vivid detail. The fence standing proudly, the devices partially exposed in glints of reflection, the movements of neighbors and visitors forming an unintentional chorus of witness. In this environment, deception became increasingly difficult. The first stage of confrontation began with a careful display of the evidence. Photographs of camera placements, reflections, and inconsistencies in the HOA's own letters were compiled and laid out where they could be observed. The bright daylight illuminated each photo with stunning clarity, highlighting shadows, angles, and metallic reflections that the HOA likely assumed were hidden. The evidence itself became undeniable, a visual argument that required no words, no dialogue, just observation under the scrutiny of the sun. By mid-afternoon, the stage was set. The fence, once accused of illegality, had become a symbol of resistance and revelation. The cameras intended to intimidate now served as proof of misconduct. Every metallic glint, every reflection in sunlight, every shadow had contributed to a narrative that could no longer be denied. The HOA's own tools had betrayed them, revealing a calculated pattern of monitoring, manipulation, and abuse of authority. Neighbors began to take note, their curiosity transforming into engagement. The bright daylight exposed them as both witnesses and participants in the unfolding drama. Every step they took, every glance they cast toward my yard, reinforced the narrative that had begun to emerge. The fence was not the problem. The HOA surveillance and deceit were. The evidence, laid out in plain sight, spoke volumes, illuminated under the clarity of day. As the afternoon wore on, the first real confrontation loomed. The evidence of misconduct was too strong to ignore, yet the atmosphere remained tense. The bright, unyielding sun shone across the property, casting long, revealing shadows across the fence and devices, ensuring that nothing could be hidden. The HOA's previous power, based on secrecy and intimidation, was now vulnerable to exposure under the scrutiny of the day and the careful documentation that had been compiled. The fence had started as a simple boundary, a protective structure around my property. Now, it had become a focal point for a larger story, a story of deception, surveillance, and the audacity of authority misused. The devices had been discovered, patterns mapped, inconsistencies revealed, and the neighborhood itself had begun to witness the truth. The stage for confrontation had been fully established, the evidence clear, and the sun unrelenting in its illumination. As shadows lengthened with the approach of evening, the implications were clear. The fence issue had been a smokescreen. The real issue was the HOA's misconduct, exposed in bright daylight and documented meticulously. The next chapter would bring the first direct response, revealing how the HOA would react to the undeniable truth and setting the stage for public exposure and accountability. The sun had reached its zenith, casting sharp, unforgiving light across the neighborhood, illuminating every detail with a clarity that no shadow could escape. The brightness of the day seemed almost theatrical, spotlighting the stakes and transforming ordinary suburban streets into a stage for revelation. Each fence post, every branch, and all reflective surfaces on cars, windows, and even the shed at the far end of the yard now acted as witnesses, catching glimpses of movement, angles, and metallic glints that the HOA had hoped would remain hidden. I began the morning by reviewing the evidence once again, compiling the photographs, angles, and reflections into a sequence that told an undeniable story. Each glint of metal, every camera lens partially exposed under the bright sunlight, formed a clear pattern, a coordinated surveillance network orchestrated by the HOA. The pretense of concern over an illegal fence was now unmistakably revealed as a smokescreen to conceal a much larger, more invasive operation. The bright clarity of the day emphasized the audacity of their deception and the meticulous detail with which they attempted to manipulate perception. Neighbors had started to notice the subtle commotion. Some lingered, casually watching from driveways or through windows, while others walked slowly past, their curiosity palpable. The fence, once merely a border, had become a visual symbol, standing tall amidst the sunlight, almost defiantly, as though embodying the truth that had been hidden behind layers of HOA pretense. Their own tools of observation, cameras, lenses, and reflections, had betrayed them, and now the evidence was laid bare for all to see. The first sign of movement came mid-morning. A pair of HOA officials appeared, clipboard in hand, approaching my property in their familiar measured way, confident in the authority that their position afforded them. Their expressions were tight, controlled, masking awareness of the inevitable. The bright daylight, however, revealed everything. Shadows of their steps stretching unnaturally across the lawn, subtle glint from their badges reflecting in angles that hinted at a moment of unease. Even without words, the sunlight seemed to highlight their discomfort, revealing what they hoped to keep hidden behind polite professionalism. As they neared the fence, I directed my attention to the evidence display, photographs of devices, angles, and inconsistencies in their own letters. Each image caught the sunlight, emphasizing metallic reflections, shadows, and perspectives that could not be ignored. The evidence was not only detailed but undeniable, illuminated as though by an unseen hand, exposing the coordinated surveillance network. Every HOA official approaching that day would see it, and the clarity of the sun rendered any denial impossible. The bright daylight did more than reveal the past. It created an active tension in the present. The neighborhood, already observing in subtle ways, became a theater of scrutiny. Every motion by the HOA officials, every shift in stance, was captured by cameras and eyes alike. The sunlight, falling at precise angles, illuminated the fence posts, the shrubbery, and even small metallic devices previously overlooked, leaving nothing unseen. The sense of exposure was palpable. The officials were no longer in control. Their narrative had been dismantled by the brightness of day, the careful observation, and the meticulous documentation of evidence. The confrontation escalated as subtle interactions unfolded. Each officer's attempt at authority was undermined by the evidence arrayed before them. The photos, maps, and angles of surveillance devices told a story that contradicted every claim about illegal construction. The bright daylight acted as an impartial witness, casting shadows that emphasized every inconsistency and metallic reflection. Every reflection, every lens, every slight glint of sunlight on a wire reinforced the truth. The HOA's claims were baseless. Their focus had been deception, and their authority had been misused. By mid-afternoon, the scene intensified. Neighbors began to cluster discreetly, curious about the growing tension. The sun, still high and unrelenting, highlighted every movement, every glance, every metallic surface that had been part of the HOA's covert operation. The evidence no longer resided only in photographs. It had become tangible, visual, and almost accusatory in its exposure. The combination of daylight and strategic documentation revealed a network of surveillance so thorough that its orchestration could not be rationalized as oversight. The first direct acknowledgement from the HOA came in subtle ways. The officials controlled movements, their glances toward devices partially exposed by sunlight, the careful steps as they circled the fence perimeter. Their confidence, once unwavering, now faltered under the scrutiny of day and observation. Every metallic reflection from wires, screws, or lenses betrayed their presence and intent. Every shadow that stretched across the lawn documented their intrusion, captured in a natural recording that required no dialogue. The confrontation had become as much visual as procedural, with daylight as the ultimate arbitrator of truth. As afternoon progressed, the realization crystallized. The fence, previously under attack, had become the instrument of exposure. The HOA's network, intended to intimidate and manipulate, was now the very evidence of misconduct. Bright sunlight caught every reflection and shadow, leaving no device unseen. Neighbors, unintentionally documenting the scene through observation and their own devices, reinforced the accountability created by natural illumination. The pretense of authority was dismantled, replaced by a visible record of misconduct. By late afternoon, the intensity peaked. The sun, now casting longer, golden shadows illuminated subtle details. Wires tucked behind posts, micro cameras partially hidden under leaves, angles of observation previously unnoticed. Every metallic glint, every reflective surface, every shadow became a component in a growing narrative of exposure. The HOA officials, despite their attempts at professional composure, were visibly aware of the shifting power dynamics. The confrontation had escalated to the point where their previous narrative of control could no longer stand under scrutiny. The stage was fully set for public exposure. The evidence, illuminated by bright daylight, lay before neighbors and observers alike. The fence was no longer simply a boundary. It had become a symbol of resilience and a lens through which the HOA's misconduct was revealed. The hidden cameras, the fabricated letters, and the orchestrated surveillance had all been brought to light. The combination of natural sunlight, meticulous documentation, and neighborhood witness transformed the confrontation from a private struggle into a public revelation. As the afternoon light began to wane, signaling the approach of evening, the implications were undeniable. The HOA had underestimated the power of bright daylight, careful observation, and the resilience of those they sought to intimidate. The evidence was irrefutable. The fence had been legal, the complaints baseless, and the surveillance operations systematic. The confrontation had escalated to the point where truth, illuminated in every glint and shadow, could no longer be ignored. The sunlight poured over the neighborhood in brilliant clarity, cutting through the tension and leaving no shadow untouched. Each blade of grass, every fence post, and every reflective surface seemed to hold the story of the past days, silently witnessing the unraveling of deception. The air carried a sense of anticipation, an almost tangible electricity, as the events of the confrontation were no longer contained to private observation. They were visible, undeniable, and now public. By mid-morning, the momentum had shifted completely. The HOA officials, who had once wielded authority with certainty, now moved with hesitation, their steps measured, their eyes betraying awareness of exposure. The bright daylight revealed every detail. Micro cameras partially hidden under leaves, tiny wires tracing along fences, and the angles from which photos had been staged. Every attempt at secrecy had been stripped away by the sun, and the truth shone with unrelenting clarity. Neighbors began to gather, some intentionally, others drawn by curiosity and the unmistakable signs of tension. Phones were lifted to document reflections, shadows, and evidence of surveillance. The once hidden devices, now highlighted by the sunlight, became a focal point for collective understanding. Even casual onlookers could perceive the story. The fence had been legal, the complaints manufactured, and the HOA's true agenda had been one of covert monitoring and manipulation. The bright, unfiltered day allowed no room for denial. The culmination of weeks of observation, documentation, and patience was now in motion. Each photo, angle, and reflection laid out methodically showed a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed. The fence, standing tall and legal, had become a symbol of resistance, a visual anchor in a story of exposure. Every sunlit glint on a wire or lens told a story of attempted deceit. The narrative that the HOA had tried to enforce, one of compliance and intimidation, was now dismantled in real time under the scrutiny of day, documentation, and witnesses. By late morning, the first formal recognition of the situation began to emerge. While the HOA had tried to dictate the story of illegal construction, the visible evidence had begun to dictate its own narrative. Shadows cast by reflective surfaces outlined the placement of devices. Letters with false claims were scrutinized in the harsh clarity of daylight, and neighbors became inadvertent witnesses to the reality of the HOA's actions. Their attention, once passive, was now active, recording and validating what had been uncovered. As the sun reached its zenith, every movement, every angle, every metallic glint seemed to hold significance. The HOA officials could no longer hide behind bureaucracy or authority. The narrative had shifted from accusation to accountability. The fence had transformed from a simple boundary to a platform for transparency, standing in direct contrast to the covert network of observation that the HOA had attempted to hide. The bright daylight acted as a natural spotlight, exposing not just objects but intent, method, and strategy. By mid-afternoon, the effects were evident. The neighborhood buzzed with awareness, the presence of evidence tangible to anyone walking by. Phones, cameras, and even casual observations contributed to the public record of misconduct. Each reflection and shadow, captured and verified in sunlight, documented actions that the HOA could no longer refute. The power that had relied on secrecy and manipulation was now undermined by transparency, visibility, and the unrelenting clarity of day. The final stage of exposure arrived in the late afternoon, when the full extent of the HOA's actions became undeniable. The previously hidden surveillance devices had been mapped, photographed, and displayed in the open. The fabricated complaints about the fence, once threatening, were now clearly pretextual. The sunlight cascading across each surface had revealed the truth. The HOA had attempted to intimidate, monitor, and manipulate, and in doing so, had overstepped the boundaries of authority and decency. Neighbors, once distant and passive, began to engage more actively. Observations were shared, photos corroborated, and the collective understanding of the HOA's misconduct became undeniable. The bright, clear day acted as a witness in itself, leaving no room for excuses or misrepresentation. Every shadow, every metallic reflection, and every angle exposed contributed to a growing narrative of accountability and justice. By evening, the confrontation had resolved itself, not through confrontation in words, but through the irrefutable evidence laid bare in daylight. The HOA's attempts at control had been neutralized by visibility, patience, and the simple fact of recorded truth. The fence, once accused of illegality, stood as proof of resilience and vigilance. The devices and documents that had been intended to manipulate perception now functioned as evidence of misconduct, reinforcing the power of transparency. As the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden glow across the yard, the neighborhood seemed transformed. The story of the illegal fence had evolved into a story of exposure, accountability, and the triumph of truth over manipulation. The brightness of day had revealed every shadow, metallic glint, and reflection. Every secret intended to remain hidden had been brought into light. What began as a dispute over property had become a narrative of vigilance, strategy, and eventual justice. The fence was no longer merely a fence. It had become a symbol of standing firm against deception, of exposing hidden agendas, and of allowing daylight, literal and metaphorical, to illuminate the truth. The HOA's fabricated complaints and covert surveillance have been laid bare, documented, and made undeniable, leaving a record that would endure far beyond the moment. As the neighborhood settled and the evidence remained visible to all, a sense of closure emerged. The story that had begun with intimidation and misrepresentation concluded with exposure and accountability. The bright, clear day had ensured that the narrative could no longer be rewritten by those who had tried to manipulate it. And so, as the sun finally set, leaving behind a glow that seemed to promise vigilance and awareness, the story reached its natural conclusion. The fence stood tall, legal, and unassailable. The HOA's secrets had been revealed. The truth illuminated by daylight, had prevailed. Stand firm, protect your space, and let transparency shine. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more stories where homeowners expose the hidden truths behind HOA conflicts.